You've seen the memes and you've heard the chatter floating him as the potential Democratic presidential nominee. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, he's been a vocal figure in the pandemic response. But behind the scenes, he's been attempting to make major cuts to public health during this pandemic.
So according to the Intercept, he wanted to cut $2.5 billion in state Medicaid funding, which would mean forfeiting $6.7 billion in federal aid. Here via Skype with more on all of this is the Intercept's DC Bureau Chief and great friend of the show, Ryan Grim. Great to see you, Ryan.
Good to see you guys.
Hey, Ryan.
So there's this vast gulf between the current media and sort of like mainstream Democrat impression of Andrew Cuomo versus, in my view, the reality of both his response in this moment, which has been far less than perfect, but also his track record as governor. So just dig into that a little bit.
Andrew Cuomo has spent the bulk of his political career kind of just going to war with the left in New York State, and particularly in New York City, and in some ways going to war with New York City itself. You mentioned those Medicaid cuts. Those are going to fall most heavily on New York City. It's this Albany versus Manhattan and Brooklyn kind of contest where the public hospitals are going to be stripped of funding. Private hospitals that take up a lot of the indigent, uninsured, underinsured care are also going to be stripped of funding, all part of this kind of initial $400 million cut to Medicaid that he's going to expand to $2.5 billion cut over the next couple of years. But what's wild about the moment that we're living through, this life and death moment, is that even a lot of people in New York City who have been tangling with Cuomo for the last decade plus and know everything that's wrong with him, see him on television in comparison to Donald Trump, performing the job of governor, actually governing. And even they are like, it kills me to say this, but I am pleased with Andrew Cuomo right now. Now, those people, who, once they make it out of this crisis, hopefully, are not the kind of people that are going to stick with Andrew Cuomo. But the ability he's had to raise his national profile has certainly been disturbing to a lot of people.
Right. And Ryan, I think one of the interesting things that we've covered here, it's not like he did a particularly good job in containing this. Him and Mayor de Blasio, many of these other people were actually kind of much slower in order to respond. So much of the outbreak is a result of not having stringent public health measures in place. But so much of it seems to come down to like a performance and aesthetics, which is resonating with the Democratic base. Why do you think that is?
Well, particularly Trump. When you're comparing your leadership style to the president, who by the time, it's true that Cuomo and de Blasio did not act as fast as they should have, and even after de Blasio was telling people to stay home, he continued going to the gym himself.
Right.
So he's like, hey, I got to live my life. But you have to put that up in comparison to the president of the United States, who was saying, all of these people die of the flu, so this isn't really that big of a deal. We have 15 cases right now, but we're gonna squash it. Just 1 month ago, Kellyanne Conway, scolded a reporter asking about it, saying, "Look, it's contained. Shut up." You had who was it, Larry Kudlow, who said that it was basically airtight or almost airtight, yeah. which was a very strange phrase. You're like, wait a minute. It's either airtight or it's not. Oh yeah, this rocket, it's almost airtight. You're going to be fine up there in outer space. So, everything is relative. I'm sure in some parts of the world, the leadership on display from Cuomo would not be impressive, but his ability to show empathy and speak in sentences and paragraphs and have a basic command of the facts that are in line with the other people who are speaking, makes him look pretty good compared to Trump. And I think what bothers people most about Trump is that they hear one thing from him, and then they'll hear something different from the military folks that are up on stage with him, and they'll hear something different from the public health folks who are up there with him. And then people are just left to try to decide on their own, which of these things that they're supposed to listen to.
Right. And that uncertainty it freaks people out almost more than like you can deal with bad news because you can like, okay, that's the news, let me deal with it and adjust. But it's uncertainty that people really struggle to deal with. I also think, though, there's something to the fact that all the media is based in New York. Cuomo's in New York. As you've been writing about, other governors around the country have arguably done a much better job with the response. You profiled Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who I think has done a very effective job. Jay Inslee out in Washington, Gavin Newsom, DeWine in Ohio. So there are other governors who arguably have done a more effective job and contained the outbreaks better, but they don't happen to govern the state that is the media epicenter. And oh, by the way, it doesn't hurt that your brother has a primetime show on CNN as well.
Right, and they've also heard of him because this is a guy who's been in the New York public eye for years. And you're right, this is something that the media isn't just kind of witnessing it firsthand. They're experiencing the existential terror of it, minute by minute. And so they're watching Cuomo not just as people people reporting on the news, but as people who are consuming the news. They're worried about themselves, their family, their relatives, and so they're following his updates. They're not following Andy Beshear's updates in Kentucky, or even Newsom in California, which goes to show again this massive gulf. People talk about the flyover states, but California gets ignored just as much as Kentucky, it seems, very often. And we haven't even, like you said, talked about Washington State. These are all major cities, and Seattle going through a huge epidemic, just like New York City, and did so even before. But it's kind of out of the way of New York City. And so if you want to get something covered, have it happen in Manhattan, and that was Cuomo's secret, really.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Ryan. Ryan, based on your reporting, your insight here, is there anything to this fantasy of replacing somebody at the convention, or is it a fantasy? What do you think?
I think only if some health crisis hits Joe Biden. I don't think there's this. Well, I suppose there could be some type of political crisis that we haven't seen emerge yet, that could push Biden off the stage. But as long as he is healthy-ish and viable against Trump, there's absolutely no mechanism or even motivation for a lot of for the Democratic establishment to push him aside. Particularly, there was a poll recently that had him up by 6 points against Trump in Florida. As the pandemic continues to unfold, you're going to continue to see Trump lagging in the polls and lagging against anybody that was put up against him. In 2018, Democrats didn't win with a kind of positive message of, here's what we're going to do if we're in power. They ran against Donald Trump, and that actually worked for them in 2018. And so not having anybody at the top of the ticket, worked for Democrats. So it's almost as if they're trying to replicate that strategy. They have to have a body at the top, but they've come the closest to having a nobody up there, somebody who isn't in the public eye, but people have heard of him, and so they can kind of cast their own ideas as to what he'd be like as a president. But this allows them to keep it as a referendum on Trump in their best case scenario.
Yeah. I really think, even though it wasn't exactly an inspiring take, but Alex Wagner writing The Atlantic, "Stay alive, Joe Biden," was actually, that's essentially what you're saying here. And she made the case that essentially actually by hiding him, he's able to run on this idea of what he was like, almost like a best impression of how he was 4, 8, 10, 12 years ago, rather than the reality of who he is now, and that actually serves him and Democrats' interests best.
Yeah, and nostalgia always paints things in a warmer glow, too. So it's not just that he's running on, who he was, which would not actually be that great of a thing. He's running on what people think that he used to be, which is even better. He's kind of running as the Onion character that everybody came to love
with the vintage cars and the aviators out.
I used to love those.
Right, and so political scientists always point out that when you compare let's say it's a Republican incumbent against a generic Democratic challenger, the generic Democratic challenger always performs better against a named Republican opponent because there are people who don't like that specific person. And when you finally move from a generic Democrat to a named Democrat, there's 5-10% of people who are like, well, I hate that specific Democrat, so I'm not voting for them. And so the head-to-heads and the poll numbers go down after you've moved through that process. What they're trying to do is short circuit that and say, no, actually, this is a generic Dem. Yeah, his name is Joe Biden. He's generic Dem. So don't look at him. Just look over at this guy. And so if Trump can bring the economy roaring back and squash the pandemic, then the referendum goes his direction. If he can't, then it doesn't. That's kind of the Democratic strategy as articulated by Alex Wagner. Just stay alive, Joe Biden. Yeah. We don't want anything more than that.
That was actually exactly the argument that Bill Maher made for Amy Klobuchar. Like, just generic Democrat. Let's just go with the generic
Dem, generic D.
Just word salad.
It's inspiring stuff, truly.
Thanks,
Ryan. Thank you.
Appreciate it, man. Next on Rising, 2017 Pentagon plan. It reveals the scarcity of ventilators, face masks, hospital beds. The nation's Ken Klippenstein discusses the Pentagon plan, why that administration failed to act sooner when Rising continues.